I was debating with the head of J Street, I guess a month ago, at Temple Israel, and I took a lot of heat from friends of mine saying, you know, what are you doing debating with the enemy, with the other side, the dark side? How are you? So, and I said, you know, well, they're Jews, you know, we're all under the same tent. How are we expected to all have the same opinion on something? How is that reasonable to expect that we should all believe the same thing? It doesn't make sense just on a human level. I was raised in Morocco, then I was raised in Montreal. My father had a distinct view, and so did my mother, and so did my friends. I had 58 cousins who fought in all the wars in Israel. I kept going every summer. I had my own upbringing. And I went to my own I had my own Zionist experience. And you had your own Zionist experiences. I have a friend of mine who was raised with communist parents. How can I expect her to believe the same things I do? It's not reasonable. You know, we accept pluralism and tolerance when it comes to religion. We say, well, you know, you have Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, secular, cultural Jews. But it's the same thing with Israel. That there's pluralism in how we love Israel as well. So what I want to do today is sort of talk about this very sensitive issue of loving Israel. Because there's this whole controversy on how to love Israel. And people who love Israel, often you get to hear the famous expression of tough love, right? And the way to love Israel is to not be afraid to criticize Israel, even publicly. And then you have, on the other side, you have the whole protective view, which is sort of a little bit where I'm at, which is you protect Israel. But on the extreme, it's like Israel could do no wrong, then you have everything in the middle, and then you have some real critics of Israel. It's a mess, it's all over the place. And often I'm asked, you know, talk about how do you, David Suissa, how do you love Israel? And why is it that I love Israel the way I love Israel? Why is it? Why is it that you will rarely read a column from me where I beat up Israel about the settlements, for example, even though I'm not a big fan of settlements? Even though I'm a big fan of the two-state solution. Even though I wish we had a two-state solution and we had peace. Why is it that you rarely read columns from me beating up Israel for not making peace with the Palestinians? Why is it? I have good friends of mine, that's all they write about. Peter Beinart's a good friend of mine. He will write 10 articles nonstop, and he will relentlessly beat up Israel for why they haven't had yet a two-state solution. You got to do more. You got to do more. Whatever Israel. Can I finish? This is what I love about Jews. They're already jumping into it. I love that. Maybe because he's from Montreal, he feels he could, you know. A Landsman from Montreal. So, I have good friends of mine. That's all they'll do. And yet, I won't do that. I will not beat up Israel for why they haven't yet made peace with the Palestinians. There are a number of reasons for that. One is I really don't think Bibi waits to read David Suissa's weekly column. He said, well, Suissa wrote that I have to make peace. Suissa wrote that the two-state solution is really important. Well then, you know, let's call a cabinet meeting. Because Suissa in Los Angeles wrote that a two-state solution is very important. So one of the things I don't like to do is bore my audience. And I really think a lot of writers have a tendency to be exceedingly boring. And I think if I wrote a column reminding all of you and me how important a two-state solution was, I don't think I'd have too many readers. Because we've been there, done that. It's been said 1,000,000 times. I'm not going to sit here, come down from the mountaintop, and act like some genius who says that peace is really important. That a two-state solution is important because if we don't, we're going to have to choose between Judaism and democracy. How many times have you all heard that? 10,000? So I'm going to be 10,001? You know, I'm in the advertising business, and there's such a thing as word pollution. And after a while, if you hear something over and over again, it gets polluted. You lose all the life out of that word. We have taken all the life out of the word peace. So you'll rarely see an article from me reminding you how important peace is, because I don't treat you like kids. I don't treat my readers like kids. I think they're grown-ups. They don't need me to bludgeon them and preach to them on the importance of peace. Now, peace has, two-state solution has to do with security. I have friends of mine, every time there's a war, during the Second Intifada, I'm on the phone with them. They have 2 daughters. They put each one on a separate bus because, God forbid, something should happen. I've been there. I know what it is to be afraid for the life of your kids. So for me to weigh in and tell Israel, go ahead and risk having 100,000 rockets overlooking Ben Gurion, the two-state solution has to do with security, all right? So I respect people who do that. I'm just not one of them. I'm not going to weigh in on a decision that has to do with the security of my friend's children in Jerusalem, because I consider them to be the real experts on how far they're willing to take a risk. Who am I to come in from Pico Robertson and say, give it to them already, because you're annoying me in Pico Robertson. You're annoying me in Beverly Hills. Make peace with them already. Give them what they want, right? I can't do that, because I don't find it's my place to do that. Now, I will criticize them for the corruption in the Knesset. I will criticize the hell out of Bet Din and the ultra-Orthodox monopoly, the fact that they will not bury a Russian because halachically he's not Jewish, even though he risked his life. I've written about the opposition to the Haredi Bet Din. I have railed against their mistakes that they make in PR and so forth. I will criticize Israel, but I tread very carefully when it has to do with their security. That's why I won't read that. So, my love for Israel. Does anybody recall the article from Peter Weinhardt last year, that famous sort of the failure of the Jewish establishment? It might have been the most read article in the Jewish community in the past 10 years. It's spread all around. The ripples are still being felt. And one of my close friends is Yossi Klein Halevi. And when he read that article, he said, David, this article has an appalling lack of context. Just to give you a little bit of background in the article, it basically said that the failure of the Jewish establishment in America is that they haven't been able to find the strength and the courage to criticize Israel publicly. Okay? And he made a correlation between that and the fact that we're losing so many Jews. The young, new generation is disconnected from Israel. It was a very problematic article because I think one of the reasons we're losing young Jews is because they're disconnecting from Judaism. And if you disconnect from Judaism, you have a higher likelihood of disconnecting from Israel. But what I found especially galling about the article was the lack of context. So if you look at Israel in a pure isolated bubble, it might not reach the levels of democracy that we would like. It might not reach our standards of perfection. However, if you look at the context, if you look at the fact that this is the only civil society in the Middle East, that it's a society under siege, how many people here would love to have the whole Middle East have all the democratic flaws that Israel has? Everybody in this room, I don't even have to ask. I'll levai, like we say in Yiddish, that Syria and Sudan and Iran and Egypt and Libya and Lebanon and Jordan has all the problems with democracy that Israel has. It should only be our problem. I come from an Arab country, so when I hear about the Arab members of Knesset, when I hear, one of the things I was so proud of in America is that a secretary could take down the president of the United States, because this is a country of laws. Jennifer Flowers takes down Bill Clinton and gets a unanimous vote on the Supreme Court. Well, then what happened in Israel? A secretary gets harassed, a horrible thing. Sexual harassment is an immoral act. She goes after the highest position in the land, the president of Israel. What happens to that president? He gets convicted and he's about to go to jail. Who convicts him? An Arab judge. Did anyone know that? An Arab judge. When I hear critiques of Israeli democracy, that thing comes to my mind. when I think of the freedom we as Jews had in our country, we would have been so blessed to have a fraction of the freedom that Arabs have in Israel as Jews in an Arab country. So when I hear all the critiques of Israel, I always keep the context in mind. I always keep in mind that the freest Arabs in the Middle East live in Israel. The freest Arab press in the Middle East is in Israel. That 40% of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem, in a poll that came out last week, would run to Israel if it was ever given up to the Palestinians. Because of health care, because of opportunity, because of freedom, freedom of speech, and human rights, and the things that we rarely read about. So I keep things in context. When people talk about tough love, there's a difference between tough love and love tough. You know, I was with Peter Barnard last week, and I said to him, let's imagine my boy screwed up in school. So now I'm in front of the principal. The principal wants to kick him out of the city, not just the school. So it's a completely out of proportional punishment. In front of the principal, I'm going to defend my boy. When I get home, I might have a talking to my boy. I'll talk to my boy when we get home. And I find too often there are Jews that will line up, see a little boy on the ground being kicked by 10 different guys. And by the way, that happened to me when I was a kid in Montreal, Guy Drummond School. It was a tough school. It was in Uchimo High. My parents couldn't afford to send me to public school, to private school, so I went to public school. And I'll never forget the day I saw a boy getting kicked by 10 other guys. It was horrible. I'm not sure it was anti-Semitic, but it was horrible. I got in there, I took a lot of shots that day, and it's a thing that has stayed with me forever. Often when I look at Israel today, when I look at the disgusting movement to demonize the Jewish state, to make it illegitimate, the incredible discrimination against Israel at the United Nations, I see that little boy as Israel. And I see the world as those 10 kids beating up that boy. So I'm going to say, am I going to be boy number 11? Am I going to be the 11th person to kick Israel? Is that what Israel needs me to do in the diaspora? Should I use my mantle at the Jewish Journal and the Huffington Post to beat up Israel because they haven't yet made peace? Because they haven't yet been able to create a two-state solution? Should I be number 11 to beat up Israel? Or should I sit back here and maybe provide a little context? A little context.